Hey, good morning everyone. Welcome to day 4 of Dreamforce. Hopefully everyone's still excited, not too tired from several days of walking around. Welcome to my talk today on named credentials, securing and simplifying API callouts. It's just a quick show of hands from the audience. How many admins have we got here? Great. And how many of you are developers? Oh, very cool, very cool. How many people here are new to Salesforce? Great. Oh, that sounds good. So a real mix of people here. Well, hopefully it'll be a great session for you all, and you'll be able to take away something that you can go back and implement in your Salesforce instances. Before we get started, I need to show you this slide. I'm sure you've seen it a few hundred times already, this Dreamforce. I'm not a Salesforce employee, but please don't make any purchasing decisions based on things that I say that aren't in the product today. So a quick introduction about Groundswell Cloud Solutions. We're a Salesforce partner based up in Vancouver, Canada. We work with a number of large and complex Salesforce implementations, particularly ones that involve a high degree of customization, of custom integration, and things where we need to integrate Salesforce with other systems, whether they be back-end core systems that belong to a customer or things out on the web. As a result of this, we've actually done a lot of work with integrations and projects where we've had to use named credentials, and it's really great that Salesforce has brought out such an amazing product and feature that I'll talk a little bit more about today. So for the agenda for today's talk, I hope that by the end of this, you're able to understand how to store and use credentials inside your Salesforce org very securely for callouts that you might make. I'll start off with a bit of a background and introduction. Talk about what options are available outside of named credentials, walk through a number of different examples, show you some code, show you how to set it up, both for simple examples and more complicated ones where it might not be obvious that you can use named credentials to solve the problem that you have. So let's really get started with the basics. For some of you developers in the room, you're probably already very familiar with callouts, but for those of you who are not, HTTP callouts and Apex allow us to integrate Salesforce with a variety of external systems. So these might be things like REST or SOAP APIs provided by other vendors. Maybe you're talking to, say, Stripe.com to do payment processing. Maybe you're integrating back to your ERP, your financial system, or some other things. And what we can really do is interact with these systems and code in a really straightforward way. So here's a simple start to the request. I start up an HTTP request, set my endpoint, set the method, and then from there, I'm able to send the request, get the response, and do what I want to do with it. So this is a really straightforward example. But in the real world, we all know that it's not always this simple. You'll need to authenticate your API calls. You need to have security in place to protect people from being able to access data and systems that they shouldn't be able to access. As part of this identification and authorization process, I might have different credentials between my developer sandbox, my pre-production sandbox, my production instance. I might need to authenticate using a number of different ways, whether it's simple password-based authentication or using something like OAuth 2.0 or two-way SSL certificates. And sometimes I need to authenticate as a system user. This is the integration user that I use to talk with, let's say, my financial system. And in other scenarios, I need to actually authenticate as the Salesforce user so that I get different experiences based on who I am. So what are some of the ways that we can actually do this in Salesforce and in Apex? Well, the trivial way is to say, let's just hard code our username and password in our Apex. And I see a few smiles in the audience, and I think you sort of know that there's some really good reasons why you don't want to do that. It's a real maintenance nightmare. What if your passwords expire? You have to change code and deploy those through. It's really hard to maintain between different environments because you may need different credentials in your test environment compared to production. And it's also not very secure because you don't want your credentials ending up in your Git repository, ending up in your sandboxes where you might give access to other vendors. So we really need to take real good care about this and make sure that we don't set ourselves up for a lot of pain in the future. So some of the ways that people have solved this problem is using some of the declarative options in Salesforce. So storing credentials inside custom settings or custom metadata types and referencing it allow us to avoid the hard coding problems that we have. But some of these things really aren't intended to store secrets. You know, some people can do things like maybe put credentials in custom labels, but that was really intended more for translations than for storing something like a password. So what we can do as well is do things, say, in a managed package. A lot of people do that to store passwords and API keys to really protect them from everybody. But what I want to introduce today is named credentials. Kevin Poorman, who's a Salesforce MVP, sums this up really eloquently. Named credentials offload the storage of credentials and authentication to a declaratively controlled process. And what this really means is it allows us as developers to focus on the more interesting parts of our integration to meet the business requirements, rather than writing the boring code that's involved in authenticating, having to maintain that, and having to have admins come to us if they need to change, say, the password that we use to go into a particular environment. So let's get started. Let's start with a very basic example. So this is one where we're doing simple authentication using a username and password. So we start off instantiating a HTTP request. This is to my example.com API as a simple GET request. What I do now is I have my username and password. So in this case, I've hard coded it. I write a bit of code here to generate the authorization header. This is a format that we need to put the username password in order to send it across. And then finally, we set that header on the request, and then we go ahead and send it. So what you'll see here is I have a chunk of code here that I need to add every time I make an API call out. So let's say I'm accessing 5 different APIs to create orders, retrieve details about something. That's a lot of code to repeat, or I have to go to the effort of actually implementing some helper classes and methods that help me extract away from it. So how can we make this simpler? Let's take a look at named credentials. So named credentials here, I've just gone into setup, gone to named credentials, and I choose to create a named credential. To set this up, it's pretty straightforward. You can see there we give it a label, we give it a name, and that name is really important. That's how we're going to access it in our Apex code. We specify the base URL of the API that we're accessing, choose the identity type, choose that it's password authentication, and then I store my username and password here. So you see, Salesforce behind the scenes will store this very securely for us, and it also provides this out-of-the-box user interface where our admins can come in and change this whenever they need to change it without developers having to push any new code. So what does that do to the code that we have in Apex? Well, let's get started. So the HTTP request is still pretty much the same. But you'll notice here, instead of specifying the actual URL, I'm specifying the name of the callout that I specified before. From there, I set the method, and then I can go ahead and send the request. You'll notice here I didn't have to do any of that code around generating the authorization header. Salesforce behind the scenes does that for me, and when that API call is executed, it just gets taken care of. There's a small bonus as well. If I use named credentials, I don't need to add my URL endpoint to the remote site settings. That's also taken care of for me. So how does this sound so far? Pretty cool, right? So has anyone here used OAuth before? Great. So as you probably know, OAuth has a multi-step process where you'll go and get an access token. There's callbacks to deal with, client IDs and secrets. The first time you do it, there's a bit of a learning curve. There's also quite a bit of code you need to write to actually take care of that process, and also take care of tokens when they expire, going back and refreshing it so that your calls don't get errors. So what Salesforce is able to do with named credentials is really simplify this process. So let me jump through the example here. So here I go ahead and create my named credential, the exact same screen and setup. I enter that same sort of, let me start again. What I need to do first here, which is different, is I need to set up an auth provider. The auth provider is what I'm going to hook up to the named credential, and this basically is where I paste in the details that have come from my API provider. So here I'm hooking it up to Google. I've got a consumer key and consumer secret from Google. I've got the authorized endpoint and some other details here. I set this up and I save it. You can get all these details from whoever you're calling the API for. What we can then now do is move on to the name credential setup. So this is just like the screen I had before for basic authentication, but notice that I've changed the authentication protocol to OAuth 2.0, and what I've also done is selected that auth provider here. And what this does is it tells Salesforce, when I'm using this particular name credential, here is the service I'm trying to authenticate with, here's the client ID secret and all the callback details I need to use for it to go and instantiate that for me. But what's really cool is you'll notice here the little tick box down the bottom, start authentication flow on save. If I tick that and I hit save, what it'll go ahead and do is instantiate this whole OAuth web server flow. It'll take me to the login screen for the API provider, in this case Google. I'll be able to log in, it'll ask me, do I give permission for Salesforce to have access to XYZ? I click OK, the callback happens, Salesforce stores my auth token, my access token and refresh token, and I don't have to worry about it. I didn't have to write any custom code to handle this fairly complicated interaction. So once that's set up, we get this, it tells us it's authenticated, and we can come back and check on that at a later date. So then what does this do with our code? Well, I didn't provide an example here of actually implementing OAuth yourself because I couldn't fit that on a slide. But what we do here with name credentials is do the same thing as we did with basic auth. We set up the request, we set the endpoint, in this case to the name credential called Google Test. That's the one I created before. Set the method. I don't need to do anything funny with headers. I just send the request and away we go. So it's that simple. Behind the scenes, Salesforce will go ahead, add the headers it needs to add to your request, make the call out. If your session has expired, it'll use the refresh token to get a new access token and retry it for you, just like that. You don't have to do any of that retry logic yourself. It's all just baked in there. So how does that sound? Right? Really cool functionality. Salesforce really handles a lot of this stuff for you, make it a lot easier for yourself and your admins and other people to really get things set up. It really provides that declarative setup, no code required to do that OAuth flow. It generates that header that I talked about that's added to the request automatically as it goes through, and it does that refresh process. All of these are things that can be quite complicated to understand, but just gets taken care of for you as part of the name credential setup. Great. So what about some of our non-standard APIs? What if I don't use OAuth? What if I need to put an authorization header in a funny place? It's a custom header, custom parameter somewhere. Well, you can also use name credentials and use the merge fields that come with it. You'll notice here in the callout options, by default, generate authorization header is ticked. But I can also enable allowing the merge fields in the HTTP header and HTTP bodies of the request going out. So what's some examples? If I'm trying to set a custom header like an Auth or something like that, if I have the headers allowed, then I'm able to then use these merge fields in the HTTP headers. Likewise, if I have something in the body, think like a SOAP request or something like that, maybe there's a custom API that uses a special authentication method, I can do that with the body as well. So some of the merge fields you can use here, and there's a full list up on the documentation I've linked at the bottom of the slide, but getting the username and password out of the credential, getting the OAuth token out of the name credential. And this stuff gets merged in at the time the callout occurs, so you don't actually have to do much. You just do something in your Apex code like this, set the header, pull that merge field in, and that's it. Away it goes. So here's a really quick example. I've got a post on our company blog about using this, and this is using the Metadata API wrapper for Salesforce, where we can basically instantiate that. We set the endpoint to our name credential, set the session ID here to our OAuth token from the name credential, and away we go. We can access Salesforce SOAP APIs without having to hard code usernames and passwords, manually go through the login process or anything like that. Those 2 lines of code is what it all takes. Perfect. So name credential will also provide us with a number of other benefits. I mentioned before, we don't have to add our URLs to remote site settings. So that saves you a little step there. What we can also do is we can reference the same name credentials across our code in all the different environments. So I created before my example API name credential. The URL in production and test sandboxes might be completely different. The username and password might be completely different, but there's no changes in my code. I just deploy the change set and have the admin or whoever it is go ahead and update the credentials in the right org, and away we go. And the main thing here is it really makes things easy for people to maintain. Whether you're an admin or a developer or a business power user, you can go ahead and sort of really leverage what Salesforce provides to simplify what you have to do. And finally, Salesforce stores your credentials securely for you. You don't need to go ahead and bake your own encryption scheme or anything like that to store your credentials. Salesforce is able to do that securely in a trusted platform. So a couple of other things I want to talk about quickly are some of the other use cases. So both of the examples I had were for system authentication or named principal authentication. I can also do it on a per user basis. So here I have changed the setting to per user, and then for each user, they can go into their own settings and enter their own details. So you can have each of your sales rep enter their details for integrating with some other system, and you as an admin never need to capture that. They never need to give it to you, and they can feel safe and secure in doing so. So to quickly recap then, I hope today has been useful. I hope that you can walk away with this and know how name credentials can solve a lot of these common problems, how we integrate with other APIs, and we can store the credentials and utilize them in a really secure and reusable way. Please, 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 don't go out and hard code your credentials in Apex. It might be a quick win now, but you'll kick yourself a few months down the line when you have to change something. Go ahead, implement it in name credentials or something else where you're able to really make it a lot easier to change. And let's empower our admins. Let's empower other business users to make these changes so that when we're writing the development code and so on, we can focus really on some of the really cool and interesting problems that we're trying to solve. Remember, name credentials is really, really flexible. It supports the basic authentication, OAuth 2.0, and a bunch of other custom authorization schemes through the merge fields. So it really does a whole lot. Please go ahead and try this out in your orgs, see what you can do with it. And for those who want to learn a little bit more, have a look at these trailhead trails. There's a really great tutorial there that walks through the different ways of storing secrets in Salesforce and gives you a lot of hands-on examples about name credentials. Have a read at the documentation and the trails around making callouts, and have a look at some of the ways that you should write your code to make sure things are going to be reusable and safe. Try out the super badge and have a look at the security trail as well. The security trail is really great at covering a lot of the different things you need to know about doing things securely on the Salesforce platform. So with that, thank you very much. I'll be here for a few more minutes. If you have any questions, I'm happy to chat with you all.